Well, I'm going to hand this off to Governor Bill Ritter, our director of the Center for the New Energy Economy. Please welcome Bill.
Thanks, Mari. One of my privileges now is to introduce a representative of Wells Fargo. If you were here yesterday, you heard that Wells Fargo has been our primary sponsor for the last 4 years out of the 5 years of the symposium, and we very much appreciate their willingness to do that. It's a big financial commitment, but hopefully they've seen the work product come out of it and understand that it's worthwhile to be involved the way they are. And so today, representing Wells Fargo, the woman who's going to introduce our luncheon keynote speaker is Karen Sanchez. She is an operations consultant for Wells Fargo's Environmental and Social Risk Management Group. In this role, she's responsible for implementing credit and risk policies and systems across Wells Fargo's more than 90 businesses to ensure its consistent application. Her duties include evaluating ongoing risks in the company's business activities to protect reputational, financial, and credit risk as a core component of Wells Fargo's corporate responsibility commitment. She's the perfect person to be here today from Wells Fargo because of all of our talks that have to do with both risks and opportunities. And Karen, I'd invite you now to the stage and personally thank Wells Fargo, but thank you for being here as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My main thing today is to thank Colorado State University and all of the people in this room for all of their leadership in putting on this event for the 5th year. I mean, it's pretty amazing to get this number of people together with this experience and this dedication and commitment, and we really appreciate it. Wells Fargo is proud to support these initiatives and any conversations to bring stakeholders together to learn and share best practices. And I personally am in total awe of the dedication and the experience in this room today. So again, thank you very, very much. My job today is to introduce our keynote speaker, and that is Dr. Laurie Shell. And as said earlier, she's an energy economist. Her focus is on natural gas, power, and renewable energies. Her newest project is a power to gas project, which is changing excess renewable energy to hydrogen. She is also Vice President of Communications for the International Association for Energy Economics. She holds a Ph.D. in Mineral Economics and Operations Research from Pennsylvania State University and a BA in Economics from the University of Washington. And she comes today from the founder and president of Empowered Energy, which is in Durango, Colorado. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Laurie Shell.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today to be your keynote speaker. I'd like to thank Governor Ritter, the Center for the New Energy Economy, and the Energy Institute for the invitation. I understand that we have quite a diverse audience, so I'm going to start very broadly and drill down into a number of different topics as we go through my presentation. So again, my company's name is Empowered Energy. We're an independent consulting firm in Durango, and we provide regulatory, economic, and market analysis for natural gas, power, and renewables markets. So the title of my presentation today is Back to the Future, and I realize for the Back to the Future fans that we're a week late, but I didn't have any control over the timing. Oil and natural gas markets in transition again. And we had a couple of statements that were made in the earlier sessions this morning that I wanted to reiterate. And one was Kate Fay's idea that there is consistent change is something that the oil and gas industry deals with continuously. And that will be an ongoing theme of my presentation. So, getting started. Okay. Just to set the stage, the U.S. energy mix is a very large, slow-moving ship with a lot of inertia. This is showing from 1980 forward, or the mix of primary energy use. So this does not include electricity, which is a secondary energy, but how the U.S. economy, energy economy, has changed over time, or perhaps more said, has not changed very much over time. The other comment that I really appreciated this morning was Peter Maysmith's, that if we're going to make changes, we need to set audacious goals. Because without audacious goals, this mix does not change very much over time. And I think the best example of setting audacious goals would be Germany with their Energiewende. They have transformed the solar market on behalf of all of us. They're paying a big price for that, but they set an audacious goal. And if you see the map of solar resource in Germany, it's quite phenomenal that they were the ones to have accomplished that. So one point to get out of this slide is that our primary energy growth is slower than our population growth. And that's a result of significant efforts of energy efficiency kind of across the whole energy complex. And that will play a role as we go forward. So again, just to set a very broad stage, oil and gas are very different commodities, and their economics behind them are very different. Oil, of course, is an international commodity. Prices are set in the international markets, and natural gas is really a North American market with the primary pricing point being onshore Louisiana at the Henry Hub. Oil can be shipped in many different means. We have a lot of pipelines. We see a lot of marine transport in the international markets, trucks. We can put it in our container for our lawnmowers. Natural gas, on the other hand, really is a pipeline product. We can liquefy it and ship it in marine tankers. That's a very expensive process. We're seeing more and more of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. It requires very extensive and costly infrastructure on both ends, both for the liquefaction of the natural gas, for the tankers, and then for the regasification when it gets to its destination. And LNG has typically been tied to oil prices, and that's a very important component when we talk about the future of LNG exports from the US, or the potential future. This is a map on the top is the trade routes that exist in oil. On the bottom are the trade routes that exist in natural gas. And I've added the OPEC countries with the red stars on the upper oil-based graph so that you can see that a lot of the trade starts out of the OPEC countries. And again, there's significant amounts of waterborne trade in the oil markets, but if you can see the size of the numbers on the waterborne natural gas versus the pipeline natural gas, you'll note that the waterborne tend to be quite a bit smaller. Oil also is a very heterogeneous commodity. You've got all kinds of different parameters associated with its weight, its sulfur content, the products that can be cracked from that each individual barrel of oil. Whereas natural gas is pretty much methane, CH4, and it's traded much more regionally, again, because it's typically tied to pipelines, although we are seeing an increase in LNG trade. Globally, oil is more dispersed in terms of who's holding the majority of the reserves. There are more people involved in that. You can see that in the box there, that Venezuela has about 18% of total global oil reserves, and Saudi Arabia about 16%. Combining those, we see that Iran, on the other hand, has 34% of the natural gas reserves around the globe, with Russia being the next highest. So these have very important implications for geopolitics, which I won't touch on too much today, but just that oil is much more dispersed, if you will. Natural gas reserves tend to be a little bit more concentrated. So we've heard a lot about the Shale Revolution. It's a very recent phenomenon. As early as 2008, if you were reading documents from the US Energy Information Administration, the word shale would occur in passing maybe several times, for instance, in their annual energy review. So none of us really saw this coming. And I think I am a great admirer of the head of, he's out of Tulsa. Sorry, I'm just on the name. the Berkshire Hathaway head, the CEO, Warren Buffett. I'm sorry. So Warren Buffett in 2008 bought a significant share of ConocoPhillips when prices were at their height. And he was quoted recently in the Oil and Gas Financial Journal basically saying, "I didn't see it coming." So I just think it's interesting that there was a lot of research. George Mitchell had been working on the technology for horizontal drilling for a very long time, but this is a very new phenomenon and has really made a lot of significant changes in both oil and gas markets in the U.S. So you can see that there are a lot of shale resources, and these are specifically natural gas resources around the globe. There's a big question. We just saw our experience in shale oil and gas production. There's a lot of questions. Can the experience in the United States be replicated around the globe? We see there's a lot of shale gas in China, Russia, lots in South America. A couple of things that are different here that might make the experience around the globe maybe not as successful. And the presence of a large independent oil and gas company group is one of the things that makes the U.S. perhaps unique in that we have a whole industry segment that's not afraid of taking risk. In many of these other countries, you have national oil companies. You don't have that kind of willingness to take on risk that we see among the independents. We also, compared to some of the countries, the rule of law and property ownership, of course, are also very significant factors playing into the development of shale resources. And you can see on the right that it's really the US and Canada so far that have dominated the exploitation of shale resources. The natural gas network is very extensive. Again, that's really the only economical way to transport natural gas over land. I've circled there in the blue circle. That's the pricing point, the Henry Hub pricing point. And I won't go into all the different categories of pipelines, but who your regulator is depends on whether your pipeline crosses state lines, whether you're all in one state, whether you're a municipality. So it's a very extensive network. Of course, the oil pipelines don't have to be as extensive because they have other modes of transportation. So, and I've circled here the Cushing, Oklahoma, which is the pricing point on the New York Mercantile Exchange for oil. And this is both oil and refined products. So just again, to draw a distinction between oil and natural gas, again, there are many distinctions and they are important ones. So the natural gas shale resources and oil resources have developed in areas that are relatively new and in different locations from where the existing infrastructure has been built out. So one of the things that perhaps was also unanticipated, although in this case Warren Buffett got it right, this is crude by rail. So shipping crude oil by rail, and particularly out of the Bakken in North Dakota, because there weren't sufficient pipelines to take that crude to market. So in this case, Warren Buffett in 2009 was buying Burlington Northern Santa Fe. So that looked like a much better investment. So this is, again, something that even 2008, 2009, we weren't anticipating, but we've seen a dramatic growth in crude by rail, and of course with that we've seen some of the incidents that have occurred in Canada and other parts of North America. And that has served its purpose, but of course everybody wants to build the pipelines to get crude and natural gas out of these otherwise constrained areas. So in this graph you can see it's fairly short term, but you can see the development on the bottom, starting on the dark line on the bottom is the 2013 monitored pipeline flows out of the Bakken. You can see that that increased in 2014 and that it will be significantly higher in 2015. And similarly, the light yellow line that's starting at about 500,000 barrels a day, the 2015 crude by rail is definitely on the decline as we see more and more pipeline infrastructure being built out. And that has made significant changes occur in the pricing of oil and gas, and particularly in the gas markets. Because the Marcellus, which is in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, going up into New York, is a very prolific natural gas producer, it used to be that all of our natural gas pipelines were built to take natural gas from the producing areas along the Gulf Coast up into the Midwest and into New York, Boston, up to where the population centers were. What we're seeing now is that there's significant growth in proposed pipelines coming out of the Marcellus, because once again, there's not enough takeaway capacity out of the Marcellus, and actually kind of like taking coals to Newcastle, they're reversing some of those pipelines, they're building new pipelines, and we're going to start seeing southerly flows, out of the Marcellus, which is changing the pricing dynamics on transportation in somewhat unpredictable ways, but it's having a dramatic impact, and that, of course, affects the economics of oil and natural gas production. Okay, up until really the shale gas revolution or the shale revolution started, we could, as analysts, we would say, well, the oil to gas ratio, had a certain relationship that we could kind of count on and use one to predict the other, or vice versa. You can kind of see that I've kind of scaled this. The black is the crude and the red is the natural gas pricing. You can see that up till until about 2008, when prices really peaked together, there was arguably a pretty close relationship. After the global recession, which happened to coincide with the start of the Shale Revolution, and so I think some of the effects of the Shale Revolution were probably masked because the economy was in such a slump. You can see, though, that starting in 2009, 2010, there's really not a correlation, or not much correlation, between natural gas and oil. Natural gas has been, up and down, $2 to maybe $5.50, $6. And of course, crude oil has come down from kind of a $100 level to, $40, $45. And natural gas, actually, yesterday was the last trading day for the November delivery on the New York Mercantile Exchange for the futures contract. It closed at $2.09, I believe. And it had danced on both sides of $2 during the day. So we are seeing a further decline. I updated this graph last Friday, and if I were to have updated it last night, it would have looked a little bit even more dramatic. So as a result of these low prices, we're seeing dramatic fall-offs in the rig count. And that's, of course, an incredibly important factor, but I want to just make the point that we've been here before, and it's a little bit of the back to the future. This doesn't go back as far as it could, but if you go back, of course, to the 70s or the 80s, you would also see periods where we've seen this type of low rig count, both on the natural gas and on the oil side. On the right-hand side of this, you can also, this is the combined oil and rig count by the type of well that's being drilled. So you can see that we've seen a dramatic drop-off on vertical, the kind of the old-fashioned, at this point, vertical wells in the green, and that the horizontal wells in the red are still dominating even the reduced rig count. So why don't we see declining natural gas production? We are seeing a little bit of a decline in oil production, but so far we're seeing slowing growth in natural gas, but we haven't seen a drop-off despite the low rig count. And one reason for that, I just want to go, well, I'm sorry, I rearranged things a little bit last night. We'll get to the reason for that. One of the things that balances the markets, the natural gas and the oil markets, of course, is storage, both on the oil side and on the natural gas side. And one of the things that's going to keep prices at a relatively low level for some time to come, particularly perhaps on the oil market, is that we are pushing up against historically high levels of oil storage. If the prices aren't adequate, and again, oil, because it's a liquid much more easily handled, there's a lot more options to store it. You can store it on floating tankers, you can store it in the ground, you can store it above ground. So you can see we have a very significant overhang on oil storage. People are thinking, well, maybe prices are going to go up, so I'm not going to sell it now, I'm going to put it into storage. And that is having a very very depressing effect on prices as well, knowing that it's not going to be a very fast recovery. And we're also seeing that in natural gas. This was last week's storage report, which comes out on Thursday morning. And you can see the gray line is as high as we've ever been at the end of the injection season, which technically ends on the 1st of November. We are definitely on track to have historically high levels of storage in natural gas as well, which is one reason why we're seeing the very sharp decline in the early months of delivery, November, December, for natural gas. Because if we have this much gas in storage, the thing that's different about natural gas is that it basically all comes out on a seasonal basis. So everything that's going in this winter will essentially be withdrawn over next summer. So if we have very high levels of that, we know that most of that has to come out over the next withdrawal season, and that again is having a dampening effect on natural gas prices. So why are we not seeing a significant decline in production levels? And the main reason, well, there are several reasons. This kind of encapsulates the overall increase in productivity of every rig that's, of all of the rigs that are being drilled. So you can see this is year over year from October. These are all of the shale gas plays that you're seeing the rig productivity, and you can see without exception the productivity is up for all of those new rigs, and it's up in several different manners. One is we are taking fewer days to drill. To drill. We're also extending the laterals further on a horizontal basis, so you can get more fractures in. So each rig is producing faster and more because you're extending the laterals. So that's one reason why we're not seeing a significant decline in production yet. In oil, this is what I love the term frac log. And this is the idea that you can see throughout, really for several years, there was a buildup of inventory of wells that had been drilled but not completed. It's only about half the cost to get to the drilling stage, the completion stage. The fracking takes about the other half of the cost of a well. So you can see that kind of buildup of drilled but uncompleted wells until about the end of 2014. And then you see it's dropped off fairly significantly. So this is, my interpretation of this is that you have producers who are building up that inventory. They're now completing those wells, increasing that production, and probably doing this in the areas, of course, that are most profitable to them. So you have some cherry picking, if you will, that's also, again, keeping production levels up despite the low rig count. This is, I think, a very interesting graph that just shows the different plays of natural gas. It's basically the natural gas supply curve for Canada and the United States. And you can see the different plays that are noted there. This came out in September in the Oil and Gas Financial Journal. And at the time, you can see they have the current NYMEX price was about $2.80. That's the upper red dashed line, if you will. And you can see that there's quite a difference. I put in the lower line based on where we were last night. And you can see that going from, say, $2.80 to $2, you lose a significant amount of your plays that are in the money, that are profitable to be producing. So, we are reaching the point, I believe, where we are going to have to see some strength in pricing in response to the lower prices, the drilling rig decline. We don't know exactly when that's going to be, and the storage overhang, of course, will probably delay that. But oil and gas is typically a boom and bust industry, and we're clearly in a bust right now from a producer's perspective. That will have to turn around at some point, but the issue is always how long does it take for that to turn around? And I think there are factors that are maybe saying that's going to take a little longer than we might otherwise think. And it's similar for oil. There's as the prices decline, you lose the profitable plays, and that again, these are the shale plays. But you can see even here in 2015, and again, the declining break-even points are a reflection of that increased rig efficiency. So you can see that even at say $40, $45, kind of the range that we've been in, there's still a fair amount of oil in this case to be produced economically and at a profit. But as the prices decline, of course, you lose more and more of those economic plays. But I thought this was a very telling I found this a very interesting graph. So this is an analyst who took from 1974, took quarterly inflation-adjusted oil prices and put those prices, those quarterly prices, into buckets based on the range that each of those fell into. And so you can see here the median price of oil over that very long period of time on an inflation-adjusted basis is $30 to $40 a barrel. Probably not good if you're in the business, but I think it's interesting just to see that, again, that what comes around goes around, and perhaps there's nothing really new under the sun in the oil and gas industry. What this also, I think, demonstrates is we had gotten used to that idea that oil prices were going to be $90 to $100 a barrel. That's fairly anomalous from a historical perspective. So with the decline in pricing, of course, we are seeing pain in the oil and gas patch. Employment has clearly fallen, and you can see, if you look at the ups and downs of the changes in jobs on the lower part of this graph, you'll see it's very much reflected with the oil price. This is a Brent crude, but the WTI price in North America is very closely linked with the Brent crude price. But you are seeing that overall employment in oil and gas, and this isn't oil and gas production specifically, is falling off. So we are clearly starting to feel the pain in the oil and gas industry. And investors and consequently companies are also starting to feel the pain from an investment perspective. These are two different sets of analysts who are presenting numbers in two different ways. And I have added the colored ovals and really focused on what in the right-hand graph is called the distressed participants. There were 9 companies that were in that distressed quadrant of the lower right-hand graph that are also in the left-hand graph. And these are all, there's a couple of things. The left-hand graph is looking at the debt to earnings on the horizontal axis and the correlation, if you will, of the impact on the share price of those companies. So you can see as you get further indebted off to the right on the upper graph, your share price is taking a bigger and bigger hit with investors. Because there's some question with lower oil prices as to whether or not these companies are going to be able to service their debt with a much lower cash flow. And similarly, on the right-hand quadrant, it's the the debt to equity, so the debt over their equity value compared to, I can't read what that one is. The cash flows from operations. So similar story, although they're using slightly different, using two different ways of looking at the issue. So again, pain in the oil and gas patch. We're seeing that a lot of these companies are at 52-week lows on their share prices. So there's another side of the story. We've got oil and we've got gas, but we also have kind of gas, oil products in the shale, in the gas. So we have heavier natural gas liquids in the natural gas stream in a lot of these shale gas plays. And there are two things that drive how much of those natural gas liquids to pull out of your shale gas or out of any gas production. One is, and sometimes if the gas is very, very wet, has a lot of natural gas liquids, you have to pull it out, at least some of it, to meet your pipeline specifications. Pipelines limit the amount of natural gas liquids that can go into them so they don't drop out in the pipeline and cause fluid flows. But also when we were seeing $100 a barrel oil and maybe $4 per MMBTU natural gas, you could make a lot more money pulling those liquids out of your natural gas stream and selling them as liquids rather than selling those BTUs as natural gas. So this is another source of revenue that has dropped dramatically in value as oil prices have dropped. And it would be very interesting to see, kind of the processing, the natural gas liquid processing volumes and how they've changed as the oil price has changed. One of the components of natural gas liquids that has to be removed is ethane. And we are seeing extremely low ethane prices. And as a result of that, ethane, as we'll see in the next slide, ethane is the primary building block basically for the whole chemicals complex. It's cracked into ethylene, and really all of these circles and products that you see, almost anything that we would call plastic as a non-chemical engineer is going to somehow be tied back to ethane. So what we're seeing in the United States, we had, with very high very high oil prices and lower gas prices, we had seen a lot of, when natural gas prices were also relatively high, we had seen a lot of our chemicals processing move offshore. We didn't, that would be ammonia, urea, fertilizers, and we're now seeing those industries coming back onshore. And one reason for that is because we are now more competitive, and this is changing a little bit as the oil price drops. But this is, again, part of the differences in North America as opposed to most other parts of the world. In North America, our ethane prices are tied to natural gas. And you can see this historical graph on the left where it's almost 1-to-1. In Europe and Asia, their ethane prices are tied to naphtha, which is an oil product. And you can see that on the right-hand graph. So the relationship between oil prices and natural gas prices has a huge determinant on whether or not we make or buy our chemicals. And because we've seen such low natural gas prices relative to our $100 oil prices, we have been very, very competitive. This updates that previous graph, just showing on the left, the blue line is kind of ethane pricing based on natural gas pricing compared to what it would be if it were based on naphtha prices, the green lines above, one being Singapore and one being the US. So you can see if you can be creating your ethane using natural gas, your chemicals complex is going to be much more competitive. And the graph on the right is showing kind of the profitability of taking that ethane through the cracker to ethylene with those same three derived products, price-derived products for ethane. And again, you can see in this case, the blue line pops to the top because the ethane prices are so much lower, you're going to have much more profitability. So again, it puts us in a very good position to be chemical producers again. And we're seeing all kinds of new plants popping up, both ammonia, methanol, urea fertilizer. So you always have to take the big view, I guess, the kind of maybe economy-wide view that when the prices are very low, the producing community is suffering. When prices are very low, of course, the consuming community is benefiting, and of course, vice versa. So the reason we have a boom and bust cycle is because that's never a smooth transition from when you kind of hit as low as you can go or as high as you can go. It's rarely smooth to get back into a balance. This is the chemical activity barometer, the red line, showing how, again, with lower natural gas prices, you can see in kind of an index-based idea how chemicals has increased. And this is showing all the different components of natural gas demand: electricity, industrial, commercial, residential. And you can really see the industrial, which would include the chemicals, is on the rise, and the natural gas is on the rise, the red line on the top. Transportation, that's the last big bastion of oil consumption in this country, and we are seeing all kinds of pushes, renewable fuel standards for, more electrification, more hybrid vehicles, CNG, LNG, hydrogen, So that's, I think, an interesting area. With respect to LNG, this is showing the difference between our prices, the Henry Hub prices in the US on red, and the prices in other parts of the world. And I think the push for LNG exports is really premised on the fact, or was premised on the fact, that we could somehow capture the lion's share of that margin. And I think what's actually been demonstrated in some of the first new contracts out of, for instance, Cheniere down on the Gulf Coast, is that the Koreans and the Japanese and our potential customers are saying, you know what, we'd like to get the lion's share of that and have lower prices where we are. And right now there are about 36 LNG export facilities waiting in line to be approved, and they are slowly being approved. I think how many of them will actually get built will depend a little bit on the negotiations and who actually does get the lion's share of that margin differential in the previous slide, because if you need to build all of those expensive facilities for your profitability, you might choose to find something a little less risky and stay closer to home. This is just a slide that I had presented in 2005 where I was postulating, as everybody was, on how many import facilities would we be building for LNG. So just a demonstration of how quickly the world changes. And then, of course, if we start exporting LNG, that will change all of these flows. So I had some slides that we're going to talk about. Well, let me just do that. So despite our oil boom, we will probably remain a net importer according to the Energy Information Administration. There is a move afoot, of course, to export oil. I don't know what kind of an impact that would have. You know, we're probably about 10% of the global production, but at least on the oil side, it's looking like we'll remain an importer. On the gas side, it's looking like we will become an exporter. And of course, our response to that has been to export petroleum products. So I had a bunch of slides that we're going to talk about the link between electricity and the natural gas market. We are seeing increased pushes for electrification, and most of that will be renewables and natural gas. We need more natural gas because it's very flexible as we bring more renewables into the mix. I'm going to, I think, skip these slides so that we have some time for questions. But the one that I would like to just draw your attention to is the lower right one here. This is the impact of significant amounts of solar energy in California. Instead of having a peak demand for electricity during the day, there's so much self-generation that the utilities are actually seeing this big bite taken out of the middle of the day. And so natural gas generation is what's going to have to provide the flexibility both to ramp down and to ramp up as we have more and more renewables. Okay, I'm just going to go, the Clean Power Plan will have an impact. However, it appears that many of the coal-fired power plants that were scheduled for retirement have already been retired in kind of anticipation of those regulations. So the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with an analysis that said, actually there's a number of states that are pretty well ready already for compliance with the Clean Power Plan. So that may not have an impact on increased natural gas demand as quickly as we anticipated. Okay, I'm going to skip these, although the natural gas, greenhouse gas emissions, we've talked about a lot about leakage. Four Corners, of course, we're very concerned about this methane cloud that hangs over the Four Corners. Issues of water, we've heard a lot of different things about that. These are historical energy prices, and I just want to leave you with this idea that when you hear that energy prices only go up, be wise enough to recognize, and if you're in the industry, you'll know that, but that's just definitely not true. These are, oil prices in black, electricity prices in blue, natural gas prices in green. If you adjust them for inflation, you see in many cases are actually falling. So just be cautious when you hear claims that oil prices or energy prices can only go up. And I'll conclude with this slide. The only thing we know is that prices go up, and prices go down. Volatility will always be a part of the oil and gas industry. We are in a very low price environment that cannot last, but of course what we don't know with certainty is when things will turn around. So if you are a consumer, I would encourage you to lock in prices. They won't stay low forever. And my initial thought was for a producer, well, lock in your market share, but that's exactly what's happening in the oil markets today, and we've seen what impact that's had. So I think I would change that to say, lock in your efficiencies to increase your likelihood of survival. And I really do feel like we're back to the future, that, you know, the more that things change, the more they stay the same. So thank you very much.
I think we're going to take a seat. So, Laurie, that was really very good, and I'm going to just put a little bit of this in context. We have a steering committee for this symposium, and it's a mix of people from CSU and then other stakeholders, and one of the things that the steering committee talked about this year was having an energy economist present as our noon keynote to really talk about this in the context of sustainability, because our overall sort of theme here is this industry sustainable from an environmental, a financial, and a community and social license to operate perspective. So you've given us a great deal of energy economics to absorb, but let's delve into some of the specifics. You said, listen, it's hovering around 2, is on both sides of $2 yesterday, the price of natural gas at the Henry Hub. Where does it have to get to for production to come back? And let's take British Petroleum once had said to me in the San Juan Basin near your home, it had to really be around $4 for them to be willing to come back in a serious way into the San Juan Basin. What's the number, here in Colorado, and does it vary around the country?
It definitely varies around the country, and that one slide that showed the natural gas supply curve might be useful to put that back up, but I think it definitely varies even within the country. $4 in the San Juan would not surprise me. It's a little bit, there's not a lot of options. You see in the Northeast, out of the Marcellus, it can go east, it can go west, it can go south. So I think, the $4 range, $3-4 is probably, would give us some sustainability. I don't think at $2 we're sustainable in the long term.
So is there any place in America where you can produce oil and gas, or particularly gas? Can you produce it for $2 an MCF?
The Marcellus, it looks like parts of the Marcellus are doable, but I don't know how long that lasts.
Okay. The other fascinating, I think, graph up there was talking about risks to companies. Yesterday, American Eagle and Samson, I think both from Tulsa, American Eagle filed for bankruptcy. I think Samson did earlier in September, but looked like they were going to try and leverage some debt that they had. And this is a big problem, isn't it? That companies went into debt before the downturn, right, and now have they're way over leveraged and aren't finding a real capability of coming back out of that. How long does that continue to where we see companies that are actually filing for bankruptcy, going into Chapter 11, looking at other kinds of creative ways to survive the downturn?
I think the two main factors there, the one is clearly price. That's maybe it goes without saying, but I'll say it because that's what's driving their cash flows. I think the other part of that is really the patience of the lenders, because as they write down that debt, it's not necessarily a science. There's some wiggle room, if you will. So I think some of it comes down to the lenders and the creditors.
So a lot of this that you've talked about is just sort of kind of a good news story in the sense that it seems it'll come back. It's been here before, it comes back before, it goes way before. But we have kind of this new conversation, and new being in the last decade or so, about pricing carbon. So how much of a discussion among energy economists is there about the issue around climate change, issues around carbon pricing, and the impacts that could have both on the oil and the gas markets, the oil market internationally and the gas market domestically?
Significant. I actually missed yesterday because I was at a conference of the U.S. Association of for Energy Economics, and carbon pricing is an ongoing topic. Of course, most energy economists would prefer a carbon tax to cap and trade, just cleaner. but doesn't have necessarily the known impacts of setting a cap. But it's definitely a part of the discussion, and what will happen there. Everybody says, well, who's going to pay the tax? Well, we all know in the end we're going to pay the tax. The consumer in the end pays the tax, and as we should. It's for the societal purpose of reducing carbon. So I always, when in the earlier discussion, well, who's going to pay? Well, if the companies pay, in the end the consumers are going to pay. But it is an ongoing topic, and that will all work its way through the system. California is dealing with that with their cap and trade as they bring more and more parties into the game, transportation, fuel suppliers, and that will all get built into the price, and we will see that, if it's done right, we'll see it in our carbon-intensive products, and that should dissuade us, if we have a choice between a more intensive carbon product and a less intensive carbon product, price-wise, that we should see that reflected in the prices and change our habits accordingly.
So do you think the oil and gas industry is having a serious conversation inside the industry, not just energy economists, is sort of people looking at an industry, but inside the industry? Do you think there's enough of a conversation about it that regards the risk that it could happen?
I would be surprised if there's not. I'd very skeptical on a national carbon price. I don't think we have the wherewithal in Washington to make that happen, but we're seeing it, in the U.S. and some of the provinces in Canada. We're seeing that pricing start to happen. If the oil and gas companies aren't having that discussion, I would be very surprised.
So one of the things we haven't talked about a lot is the impact that other decision makers like OPEC have on oil pricing. So there was an article online yesterday about Middle East economies actually being in real trouble because their sovereign wealth funds have relied so heavily on the price of oil being sort of up, and $40 oil has got some of those countries in real trouble. That kind of leads into a discussion about conflict, because sovereign wealth funds going away in a place that's already as volatile as the Middle East. I know it's really probably not part of the Colorado conversation right now, but do energy economists look at that and think about that and this tie back to security and international security?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I haven't been to Doha, for example, but it sounds like an astonishing city. You hear about, indoor skiing, it's the wealth that has been generated with the oil prices in the Middle East has been enormous. And of course, now you have an expectation from your population. And so I think, the issues will probably start internally, as those sovereign wealth funds dwindle. And I think that there's perhaps, and I'm not an international oil guru, but my sense is that those who have the resources, the Saudis, for instance, we kind of looked to them, and last Thanksgiving they said, no, we're just going to keep producing, we're going to keep our market share. I think that they have the vastness of the resource at a relatively low cost. I think it's a game of chicken a little bit, that we can last longer than some of the high-priced producers, and so we're going to keep producing and bear the consequences.
So I did go to Doha 16 months ago, and I was a speaker at a conference there talking about exporting natural gas, because Qatar is the largest natural gas exporter in the world, liquid natural gas, and maybe all natural gas, but they're really concerned about the American market, and that was before sort of the downturn in the industry. But you look at it, and the question that does come to mind is sustainability. Can you sustain this kind of extravagance, really, in the way they were building out, the kinds of buildings they were building? The game clock just told us that we're out of time. I really do appreciate the perspective you've offered. It's different than what we've done in the last 5 years, and I think it was extremely helpful to the entire conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.